Hey meine Lieben, hier ist Simja und herzlich willkommen. Ich habe wieder ein richtiges Geschenk für euch und auch für mich selber. Ich präsentiere euch in diesem Video mein Interview mit dem großartigen Guy Hollingworth. Ich habe neulich erst ein Video gemacht, in dem ich darüber gesprochen habe, wie toll Guy ist, wie toll sein Buch ist, wie toll seine Videos sind. Deswegen muss ich euch gar nicht mehr so viel darüber erzählen, wie sehr er mich inspiriert hat, wie wichtig er für mich ist als Vorbild. Freut euch einfach nur auf das tolle Interview mit Guy, in dem er euch erzählen wird, wie er es geschafft hat, seine tolle Bühnenpersönlichkeit zu entwickeln. Er erzählt, wie er übt, er erzählt, wie er es schafft, die schwierigsten Griffe mit größter Leichtigkeit vorzuführen und viele andere super spannende Sachen. In diesem Video steckt so viel. Ich wünsche euch ganz viel Spaß mit Guy Hollingworth.
I don't think I've really got a secret to creativity, although I suppose that the effects I've come up with have usually been created in one of two ways. There's kind of the right way and there's the wrong way. And the right way is the way that I was taught at university. So I studied design engineering, and when you're designing a product, you're trying to identify something that's going to be successful. So you're looking for, I suppose, a gap in the market or something that doesn't exist that you think would be useful. And then you come up with ways of trying to fill that gap or come up with a solution. So I think in magic it can be the same. So for instance, two effects that spring to mind: the torn and restored card that I do and the visual twisting the aces, waving the aces. They were ones that very much I came up with because I thought it would be really good to do a torn and restored card where the pieces go back one at a time, or I want to do twisting the aces where the cards turn over visibly. So those were ones where I started off kind of having a problem or a goal, and then I just worked on different ways of trying to solve that problem. So that's kind of, I think, the right way of doing it. But if I'm honest, the way that I suppose I've come up with more things, and I think most people probably would say the same, is really by a bit of good luck and just by playing around with things. You know, just playing with a pack of cards and you find a particular move or a sleight or something that you just find yourself doing and you think, how could I apply that to something else? Or, you know, you just stumble upon an idea and things just kind of develop more organically. I would say, I suppose, the two can be combined together, because when I've come up with something like the waving the aces, and that involved coming up with a new move or a variation of a move in order to make that happen, I think then it's really a good idea to see what else you can apply that to. So you've started with a particular goal, but then once you've come up with something, you just kind of let your mind run free and think, well, what else could I use that for, and see if anything else comes out of it. I think the real secret probably is not to be limited and always to keep your mind open to other possibilities and see where it takes you. For me, the most important criteria of any routine or any piece of magic that I'm going to do is that it has to be something that I want to do. So I am I'm a hobbyist, really. I'm an amateur magician. I do some professional shows, but at heart I do it because I like doing it. And so I'm not going to force myself to do something that I don't want to do. So everything starts from, I suppose quite selfishly, what do I want to perform? What would I want to see if I was watching a show? And I think at least that way you do have quite sort of authentic and genuine material. It doesn't feel like you're just doing something because you ought to or because it's commercial or anything else. So that, for me, that's the most important thing, is it's got to feel like something that's right, that I would enjoy doing and that I think I would enjoy watching. Having said that, though, of course, the particular criteria are going to vary depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So, I put together a one-man show. I have a stage act, and as I say, I do sometimes perform commercially. So I think you obviously need to tailor the criteria to any of those situations. So certainly, if I'm looking for a piece of commercial magic that I can perform at a paid show where I'll typically be repeating it, and I might need to be strolling in order to perform it for different groups of people, then obviously there are going to be practical considerations that are going to apply about whether it can be reset, whether the same person can see it twice without problems, whether it can be performed surrounded. So, those will apply, but if I'm totally honest, they're not really my main criteria, because that's not the focus of what I'm trying to create. As I say, it's much more important to me for things that I would want to perform and things that I would want to see. And for me, the type of magic that I like is sort of visual magic. It's where things happen. Mentalism is very popular, and I understand why, and people do it very well. But to me, that doesn't excite me in the same way as something appearing or disappearing or changing. I'm trying to create magic which has that sort of visual appeal as well as being mysterious. So I think in many ways that probably is my most important criteria, or those are my two important criteria. Something that I would feel comfortable doing and I want to do, and related to that, something where, physical magic happens, something actually happens rather than just happening in the mind. I think the first thing, before you worry about whether something is a good improvement, is how do you know whether or not it's actually a good method in the first place? And that really struck me when I was working on the Torn and Restored card, the Reformation that I do, because I think most people would say the method is quite difficult. Weirdly, because I've been doing it for so long, it doesn't really feel like that to me now. It's one of the effects I feel most comfortable doing. But just taking a step back and also thinking about when I was first coming up with it, it's really quite difficult to do. And I remember when I was first coming up with it, practicing it, I was at university, and I remember quite vividly I had a single mirror in the room that I had over a sink. So I was practicing and I kept dropping the cards in the sink and they kept getting wet. Anyway, I was practicing and I was just trying to see, does this look okay? Is it all right? And I realized after a while that, if you read somebody else's trick and it's difficult, it's going to take a lot of practice. So actually, when you're coming up with an effect or a move, that might take practice as well. So I think you actually have to persevere a bit. And sometimes things which look awful to start with, it's not actually because it's a bad method or it's a bad trick. It's just because you haven't practiced enough. So I think you do have to persevere. But in terms of how do you know if an improvement is worth making, I think that's really difficult actually, because typically, we all like our own creations. I mean, I'm particularly guilty of that, but, well, I don't feel guilty because that's part of the reason I do magic, is because I enjoy creating things and I'm not trying to be commercial, so that's kind of okay, I guess. But we do tend to love our own ideas. And I think there is a real risk that if we have an idea for an existing plot or an existing trick, we sort of automatically tend to like it because we've thought of it. And the reality is a lot of improvements are not really improvements at all. And I did actually kind of touch upon this in a talk I did a while ago at EMC, the Essential Magic Conference. The online conference, and it was a talk I gave called 7 Lessons I Learned from a Packet Trick, which basically was a true story. It was a packet trick that a friend and I had come up with many years ago, and it wasn't great, and I thought I could improve it. And I went through a number of different ways of refining the trick, making it look more natural, and I think they probably were genuine improvements. But the lesson at the end of it was, frankly, after I'd done all of those things, I still don't think it was that good a trick. So ironically, I've never performed it. And I think it takes quite a lot of courage to do that. If you've come up with something that you like or that you've improved or you think is better than the original, to say, well, I'm still not going to do it because even though it's better than it was, it's still not that great. That is quite a difficult thing to do. But I think it's something that maybe we should all do a bit more than we do. And I'm sure I'm guilty of not doing that. But yeah, I think just because you've sort of notionally improved something, it still doesn't mean it's necessarily worth performing. Well, I can say I definitely don't perform anyone else's material verbatim, as in sort of word for word. Frankly, I really don't perform other people's materials at all, really. That sounds a bit arrogant. It's not meant to be, and it's certainly not because I think my material is better than anyone else's. It's really because the creative process for me is a very important part of magic, and it's what I get most enjoyment out of. So I do pretty well only do things that I've come up with, just because I say that's part of why I do it in the first place. When I was performing magic more commercially, when I was doing shows at sort of restaurants or banquets, those sorts of things, there were a few routines that I used to do. I used to do a cups and balls routine that was largely based on David Williamson's routine. And I stopped doing that because I actually don't think it fitted me particularly well. I didn't, it's a great routine and it got a good reaction, but it never felt quite sort of like me. So more recently, to be honest, I think pretty well everything that I do is at least changed from something that existed before, or something that I've basically come up with myself. really, I say, because that's kind of what I enjoy doing. To be honest, it actually took me quite a long time to work out what my persona should be. When I was getting interested in magic as a teenager, I was at school. This was, I suppose, in the late 1980s. And there was a lot of American culture, the films, a lot of the music, a lot of the TV. The stuff that I think young people at the time in England thought was kind of cool was largely American, well, in my perception at least. And being sort of old-fashioned and English seemed quite boring. In fact, actually, my parents were older than most of my friends' parents. I'm an only child, and I arrived quite late. And I think as a result of that sort of influence, I think at school I was perceived as being even a bit sort of old-fashioned, even when I was a child, weirdly. And I didn't really like that. You know, I sort of wanted to be one of the cool kids. And if I'm honest, I wasn't really. So my initial persona was to try to be something I wasn't, was to try to be sort of cool. And there was, I mean, this is excruciatingly embarrassing actually, but there was a time when I did actually do some shows trying to put on an American accent because I kind of thought that would be cool. And it was horrific beyond belief, I'm sure. But there we are, these things you learn from. And it sort of took me a while, as I say, to realise that I should make a virtue of the fact that, you know, hey, I am who I am and I'm British and yeah, maybe I am a bit old-fashioned because I was brought up by slightly more old-fashioned parents than my friends. And I think, again, perhaps I'm making this up in hindsight, but it sort of fits in with a few films like Four Weddings and a Funeral at the time, where I sort of thought actually people like Hugh Grant were becoming more recognised as, and there seemed to be quite a lot of English actors. And I sort of thought, well, actually, I suppose maybe I can be English and not be kind of ashamed of that. And that sort of is my more natural character. So, I mean, the advantage of that is that, well, the main advantage is I don't have to put on an American accent. That's a big plus for the audience more than me, but for everybody. But, I mean, to be serious, it does mean that you can kind of forget about acting and pretending to be somebody else. Now, I think when you are performing, you naturally do tend to be a slightly heightened version of your own character. And once you sort of figure out that you're going to be more or less yourself and you can think about those sort of eccentricities or the things that you want to make more pronounced, it's quite easy to do. So having worked out that I was really going to sort of play on the fact that I'm English, then I suppose what I wear and how I speak and even the effects that I do sort of follow. So I think once you've got that nailed, it does make it a lot easier to make the other sort of creative decisions. So I think the advantages are many, that you have a sort of ready-made shortlist of outfits and words that you'd use and material. In terms of the disadvantages, well, I mean, the main disadvantage, of course, is it depends whether or not you are an interesting or likable character. And, you know, because I'm not pretending to be something else, I'm kind of just taking my chance. And if people like a sort of an English performer and they like my sense of humour, well, that's great. But if they don't, well, it's kind of too bad. So I suppose it's going to vary from person to person, and there's a lot of luck involved as to whether or not, you know, your normal persona is something that people want to watch. And as I've said many times, because I'm not really doing this principally for commercial reasons, I don't have to worry about it too much. If people want to watch what I do, then that's great. But if they don't and they'd rather watch something else, that's fine by me. So I would say essentially it makes it easy to be authentic if you are authentic, you know, you're being yourself. So to me, it sort of makes sense to do that. Well, I think it's intentional. Certainly, subconsciously, it was what I was aiming to do when I started, for a very simple reason. That the reason I really wanted to get into magic was seeing Channing Pollock. He was always my idol, as it were, my hero. And seeing him perform on a British programme called The Best of Magic, when I was just sort of starting to take an interest, to me, that was what magic was about. It was about that elegance and that very slow performing style of things happening amazingly, but at the same time, you knew that the performer that you were watching was somebody very skilled. It wasn't somebody where magic was just happening and, it could have been done by trick material. You knew, even though you couldn't see the sleight of hand, that the magician was very skilled. It was a bit like, kind of a James Bond elegance. There was something about, James Bond in a dinner jacket dealing out hands of baccarat or something in a casino. That was the sort of feel I got from Channing Pollock. That very much attracted me, and that was something that I always wanted to try and do. It's obviously very difficult when you're at school to try and to do that. There are not many school children who are sort of elegant. So it kind of, it took a backseat for a while. I got into doing gambling routines and that sort of stuff where that performing style wasn't as important. But certainly at the back of my mind, yes, that was certainly an aesthetic, I suppose, that I always had. And I do think it's, it makes a difference. I think if you try and dress nicely and if you try to have props that are, clean and elegant and sophisticated, I think it does elevate and give greater value to a performance. Depending on your style, there are of course many people who very successfully and deliberately do completely the opposite of that and are very wacky and chaotic, and that works very well for them. But, going back to my previous answer of me as a character, I think for somebody who is kind of quite an old-fashioned British sort of character, trying to be elegant. I don't know if I succeed in doing so, but trying to have that kind of style of performance and props and apparatus that goes with it, it just sort of seems to fit. So yes, to the extent that I can, I've tried to make that a deliberate thing. Well, at a purely practical level, I think if you are fairly naturally, you move quite slowly and you talk fairly slowly and deliberately naturally, then obviously if you speed things up when you're doing a sleight, then that's an obvious sign there's a discrepancy and it's going to signal to an audience that you're doing something. So on a purely practical level, I think in order to try and disguise things, keeping everything in a similar way, a similar feel to how you behave normally is obviously really important. But I think perhaps even more fundamentally for me than that is that I find it much more difficult to allow a reaction, to allow an effect to sink in so as to get a reaction if I'm rushing it. And I mentioned earlier the cups and balls. Now the cups and balls is a routine which to me is a typical example of something that people tend to rush. And the reason for that is because the method really demands that you rush. It's because you're always only just one step ahead of the audience. You have a ball and you do a false transfer and it disappears. So that's a good effect, but now the ball's in this hand. So you have to load it into the cup as you take the next ball off before the audience has a chance to think it's in the other hand. And then you've got the next ball and you do another false transfer and it disappears. And now again, you've got one here, so you need to move on. And you're always kind of rushing to get ahead. And I think as a result of that, a lot of people perform the routine basically for laughs, which is, it's fine. And it perhaps laughter is a more valid and valuable reaction in some effects than mystery. But to me, if I'm going to do that trick, I've always thought that, if you could actually take a cup and show it's empty and put it on the table and then have a ball appear underneath it, that's an amazing and very pleasing effect. And yet that effect is very seldom really perceived in cups and balls because everything is happening so quickly. So more recently, the reason I give that as an example is I have been more recently working on a routine which is intended to be done slowly for that very reason. I wanted it to be a cups and balls routine where you actually can show there's a ball and you can show an empty cup and the ball vanishes and you can show both hands and then you can show it's appeared under the cup. To me, particularly for my performing style, that gets a much better reaction than rushing through and trying to be sort of funny and wacky and crazy, because that doesn't suit me, and even if people do laugh, it doesn't feel like an authentic reaction to me. So I think slowing things down actually makes things more powerful more often than not. Well, the first thing to say is that some sleights and some techniques don't look natural for me when I do them. And so I don't do them. That's kind of the obvious answer. For instance, I mean, palming a card, if I were to palm a card in classic palm, so, I've got a few cards here in classic palm, I know that I have kind of windows between my fingers. So if that is going to be held in a way that you can't see the cards, I need to hold my fingers quite closely together. And I mean, try as I might, I can't make this hand look particularly natural. I mean, it's fine if it's by my side or, if it's out of the way, it's kind of okay. But I can't have this hand in the field of view for very long with cards in my hand. It just doesn't look natural. So I just make sure that I don't do that. If I need to do an effect where I palm the cards, I'll either leave palming until right at the very last moment, or I will find some other way of doing it. There are other people, my friend Chris Power, for instance, who can hold a card in his palm naturally for half an hour and no one would suspect anything. But he's got different shaped hands to me and it looks great for him. So for me, I mean, I know I really like the lateral palm because to me, that looks a lot more natural. My hands are in the position more or less that they would be in if I didn't have a card palmed. And yet, I can palm cards in the lateral palm position. So I will use that technique in order to overcome that. But then, of course, you have other problems that it's not, you can't perform surrounded, you have to be careful with angles. I think it's a question of trying to find techniques and methods that work for you and that you can use in certain circumstances, but you may realise that you can't use them all the time. So I suppose that's the first thing to say. The other thing is you ultimately, I think, do just have to practice and see what things look like. When I was growing up, video cameras were not really a thing. I mean, I had one when I was a little older, but when I was at school and I was practicing, I just had a mirror. And of course, there's a danger in a mirror that you get used to looking at your own hands and not eye contact with the audience. But in terms of actually getting sleights to work, it's a good starting point. You can just watch yourself. If you're honest with yourself, and you get used to sort of making sure you keep an eye on a shoulder and make sure that that's not looking unnatural when you're palming things. If you keep your mind on it, I think you can learn a lot from looking in a mirror. And now from video footage, of course, you can record yourself. And I think that the key is to really be honest and ask yourself when are things just looking odd, and just try and find ways around it. So I don't have a particular secret to it, but I think it's just being aware of it and trying to find ways to deal with it. Well, I'm slightly ashamed to say I'm not sure that I am entirely on top of my material. We've now been in lockdown in varying degrees for about a year in the UK. And there are some things I really haven't practiced, kind of at all, to be honest. I've started doing a stage act quite recently, and I really feel that I ought to practice that on a regular basis to keep it up to speed. But the reality is I don't. I probably should, certainly in terms of the normal material that I do. I've done a few shows and bits and pieces over Zoom, but I haven't really had occasion to need to practice. So I think probably at this precise moment, I don't have a good answer to that because I don't think I am very on top of things. I would say that material that I have been doing for a long time, it seems that it just becomes ingrained. So the torn and restored card, it just seems to be something that even if I haven't done it for months, all I need to do is just run through it a couple of times, and basically the mechanics are, I hope, almost as good as they were the last time I did it. And I think I've performed it enough that the way I perform it is probably fairly ingrained as well. Working on new material, absolutely, I find I do need to rehearse it quite a bit. And I think in answer to the question, do I perform individual moves or routines or the whole thing? The answer is you need to do all of them. And certainly the first time I do my stage act again after lockdown, I will be thinking about that several weeks before I actually do it, because I will need to, not exactly start again, but yes, I will need to start with the individual sleights and make sure that I'm comfortable with those, and then I'll need to start doing the whole routines, and then I'll need to rehearse it properly with the music and in costume and everything else. So I think you need to do all of them, and I think probably as magicians, particularly as an amateur magician like me, there is a tendency to spend too long practicing the sleights and not long enough practicing or rehearsing the entire presentation and the performance. So I think ultimately you do have to do a bit of each, and I'm pleased you asked that question because maybe it will motivate me actually to start practicing my stage act, as I should have been doing for much longer. To me, the most fascinating thing about magic is the premise itself of what magic is. It is deceiving intelligent people who can see and hear like everybody else can, but you're setting yourself the challenge of doing something, ideally live, I think that's more interesting to me, in front of them, which they believe is impossible. So it's a bit of a battle of wits almost. It's working out a way of achieving the impossible in a way that withstands scrutiny. And for me, putting the pieces together and trying to make something deceptive, and as I've said before, to me the creative side of it is really important. So I think putting everything together and doing something that's perceived as being impossible is a really fascinating idea. I suppose in some ways it's a little bit like, well, the mindset is a bit the same as law, I suppose. You know, when I'm in my day job, I'm a barrister and I'm trying to put together an argument. I'm trying to persuade a judge of the correctness of my position. And I think sort of thinking about how to construct things in a way, obviously then I'm not deceiving anyone, but I'm trying to create things in a way which steers people to a particular outcome. I think that process of putting everything together is quite similar. But as I say, in magic, the fact that you are trying to do something which is inexplicable, it has no explanation, I think is the most fascinating part of it for me. Well, I didn't really feel qualified to give advice to anyone, far less to the whole world of magic. All I can say is that I do magic for one reason only, and that's because I enjoy doing it. And it seems a bit odd to me that people would do it for other reasons, because if you are trying to make a living, I would have thought there are easier ways of doing it. It's quite tricky, I would have thought, to make a living out of magic. If you're trying to, solve problems in the world, magic obviously can help and people enjoy watching it. But I just kind of think it's an odd thing to choose to do unless you're doing it because you enjoy it. So if that is your starting point, then surely the advice has to be do whatever it is that makes you enjoy it. Now, I think it's really important that people do take magic seriously. It shouldn't be trivialized. But I sometimes think maybe people take it a little bit too seriously. We should remember ultimately that it's a fascinating form of entertainment. It can be very artistic as well. But I would personally say that unless you're actually really enjoying doing it, then what's really the point of doing it? Is it the right thing for you to be doing it at all? So my not really advice, my message is to focus on enjoying it. And I think that if you enjoy it, then when you perform it, that enjoyment shines through, and hopefully it means that your audience will enjoy it as well.
So, ich habe euch nicht so viel versprochen. So viel tolles Wissen war dabei. Danke, Guy. Ich danke euch auch, dass ihr dabei wart, dass ihr euch das alles angesehen und angehört habt. Das war euer Simeon. Tschüss.